This woman, who you may have passed a picture of as you walked in, her name is Carrie Chapman Catt. She said, to get the word male out of the Constitution cost women of this country 52 years of their life. It was a pauseless campaign. Think of it, if you started working on that at 20, you might not see it happen in your lifetime. The path to the vote took women incredible courage, dedication, and grit. It took women willing to experience defeat, to pick themselves up, and to continue on. Those women were pursuing a goal, in many cases, that they themselves might never see the objectives of themselves, right? They were doing it for others, for their children, for their grandchildren, for their daughters and their granddaughters. But the 19th Amendment wasn't just good for women. In fact, it's been good for all of us. 100 years ago, thanks. 100 years ago, there was fear about women voting. Of course, the fear mostly belonged to men. Let's be honest, right? But that really comes back to how the vote that women would gain would impact the world that men then controlled. There was concern that women wouldn't be fit to make political decisions. Thank you. Men worried that granting women the right to vote might affect the temperance movement, as many women did prefer prohibition. But perhaps the greatest concern was that granting women the right to vote would open the door for others, including people of color, to that same right. Yet, those amazing women of our early history, they did not stop trying. They did not give up. They marched on. They challenged the existing norms by parading, and I saw some of the sashes. I was pleased to see that, because they would parade through town, and then they would soapbox. Soapboxing is the idea that a woman would stand on a box in the public square, perhaps even downtown, and then speak out on issues of the day. Now, think of it. The brazen political act of a woman speaking for herself in public? Well, 100 years ago, that was unheard of. Hopefully, in your house and in your community, that's not the case today. So, the 19th Amendment did finally pass when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. But the work wasn't done. And as Carrie Chapman Catt said, now that you have the vote, what are you going to do with it? And it is from that very struggle that the League of Women Voters was born and continues today. Their mission states to encourage the informed and active participation of citizens in government, increasing understanding of major policy issues, and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. So in brief, to the League, democracy is not a spectator sport, not something we can watch happen, but something we must participate in. 30 years after the vote, the women marched on. The war had come to a conclusion, but during the war, women had worked in the factories, on farms, in their homes, in support of the war effort, for the good of our country, but also for the good of their own family members and the safe return of their fathers, their uncles, perhaps their brothers, their cousins, in some cases even their husbands, sons, or daughters. Some, like my mother's cousin, are epitomized here by Rosie the Riveter. My mother's cousin was a quality parts specialist in the Willow Run assembly plant building B-24 bombers. After the war, she lost her job and was replaced by a man who had come back from the war, and she then was given a lesser job as a secretary because that was considered an appropriate role for women at the time. She spent the rest of her life working toward fair labor standards and equal rights. 50 years after the vote, the Civil Rights Amendment had passed, and my wife Susan and I were just toddlers. Women were beginning to gain opportunity, although their options were still often limited. In fact, Susan's mother had become a nurse, and it was a job that women were allowed to do at the time, nursing and education, it seems. But when she divorced in 1980, she realized that she couldn't raise her family of 3 on nursing wages. And so she too marched on in her own way and became a successful realtor, and eventually was even invited by the Kettering Rotary Club to become the first female member of that club. Yeah. Because of brave women like her and like her mother before her and all those early suffragists, my wife Susan and I certainly benefited. Susan could make her own choices. Susan, my wife, could open her own bank account, establish a credit card. She could sign the lease agreement for her first apartment without the need for some man to co-sign that for her. That wasn't the case for her mother or her grandmother. Susan could work to develop state public policy and support elected officials. She could eventually build and own her own company. 70 years after the vote, we started our family. Because of the early suffragists, our children now can share their voice too. And they have. In fact, my daughter here protested on Wall Street. My son is supporting Somali refugees in Columbus. And my youngest daughter works the polls on Election Day. And all of them are able to support issues and candidates that they believe in. So progress has been made, although certainly it has been slow, and certainly there is still work to be done. Here we are, 100 years after the vote, and the march continues. The League of Women Voters here in Ohio has worked to change partisan gerrymandering so that voters can choose their elected officials rather than have elected officials selecting their voters. For years, women were denied the right to vote, and for many more, people of color were likewise denied. But why? Out of fear? Yet, what were those people afraid of? Those fears were unfounded. Women and people of color are adding to the richness of our democracy, and for that, they should be celebrated. According to the Center for American Women in Politics, women in elected office now have grown from 3% in 1970 to nearly 25% today. Women now make up 27% of the mayors in our nation's largest cities, 29% of the state legislators, 23% of U.S. congresspersons, and nearly 9% of the U.S. Congress is made up of women of color. So progress is being made. While you may be thinking, hey, that isn't enough, and you would be right, however, these women are adding their important voices to the dialogue that we know as democracy. So my wife, my daughters, my granddaughter, and their friends are benefiting from the sacrifices made by those early suffragists. My wife has gained opportunity, and you know what? Especially men, you know what? Opening those doors for her didn't close a door for me. My wife's desire to work and own a business didn't take away from my importance to the family. My wife's fulfillment in her career didn't take away or diminish my fulfillment. It expanded it. So yeah, there's still work to be done. And that's why I belong to the League of Women Voters. I support it. That is why I work as a teacher to help young people find and use their voice in our community. But let's face it, the League taught us this. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires our active participation. Yet, in the last election, nearly 50% of eligible voters didn't bother to cast a ballot. Perhaps we need to think like the suffragists thought, beyond ourselves, for our daughters and for our granddaughters. And when I do that, then I support the rights of those around me. I support the rights of women, support the rights of minorities, the rights of immigrants, the rights of the LGBTQ community, the rights of every person. When I do that, then my own life and the life of our democracy is immensely enhanced. The passage of the 19th Amendment wasn't just good for women. It was good for all of us. We all have the vote. The only question that remains is, what are you going to do with yours?